So this is the road to the COVID-19 vaccine with Medcan Medical Advisory Services team member, Dr. Jason Abrams. Dr. Jason Abrams is the Associate Medical Director and a Senior Medical Consultant at Medcan in Toronto. He's a graduate of the Shulgan School of Medicine at Western University. He's completed a residency in family medicine at McGill University. We'll allow people to just read through the bio as they see fit. Dr. Abrams, we were talking about the fact that you just have a new son, 3 months old, and that's been good through the pandemic. So thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks again so much for having me, and it's great to be able to speak to everybody today about updates related to the COVID pandemic and where we're headed as a world, essentially, because we're all in this together.
So we're going to start with a poll. So I'm going to launch the poll. So the poll is a pretty simple one today. The poll is this: given the information we have today, would you be prepared to take a COVID-19 vaccine? So we'll allow people to make their decisions on that. While people do, we'll advance, and we're going to start this one. So today's is about the road to the COVID-19 vaccine. Aside from asking when it will arrive, the COVID-19 vaccine prompts a lot of questions. How effective should we expect it to be? Will it be the panacea that everyone hopes? How does it change things for employers? Medcan's Dr. Jason Abrams provides guidance. So we have, okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. The results are, so we have even, we have 50% said yes, they would be prepared to take the poll, and we have 50% saying not enough information or unsure. Okay, so that's interesting. I think that provides a nice segue for Dr. Abrams' presentation. Why don't you start, Dr. Abrams? And folks, we will be accepting questions at the end, so you can press just the Q&A button, or through the chat function, you can ask questions as well, and then we'll field them. We'll try to field all of them at the end of the presentation. Dr. Jason Abrams, take it away.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I'm very encouraged to hear that of all our guests today, nobody said no to vaccination, which is great because everybody's at least open to the idea. So I think before we hone in on what's going on with the COVID vaccine particularly, I would ask everybody to think about the refresher. Why do we vaccinate in general, right? There's so many people who have such strong opinions about vaccines and what it means, but I wanted to remind everybody about the purpose of vaccination. So the first reason that we vaccinate is to protect an individual, to protect ourselves against a viral infection. And the thought is that once we receive a vaccination, we are now immune against that virus, and we can no longer be susceptible to acquiring that infection in the future. Another reason that somebody might vaccinate is to protect loved ones. So for example, you know, Chris mentioned that I have a newborn baby at home and he's 3 months old. And for the most part, he hasn't received his vaccinations yet. So I, as a father, might vaccinate myself against viral infections in order to protect my son who's not eligible for vaccination. And there may be other people in our families or people that we know or people that we're exposed to in our workplace who that might apply to as well. Lastly, and I think the largest concept that we've actually heard a lot about in the media in recent months is the concept of herd immunity. So we might vaccinate ourselves to help with community protection against spread of a virus. Herd immunity is the concept whereby there is a sufficient percentage of the population that will receive a vaccine to become immune against an infection, so that all of those left over who are unable to vaccinate for certain reasons will also be protected against spread of this kind of infection in the community. So for example, with measles, we know that once the measles vaccine came out and most people were getting vaccinated, measles really disappeared from our society in general. People weren't getting the infection. But over time, as there's been controversy about the vaccination, when the vaccination rates in the community drop below a certain threshold, we start to see the infection come back again. Now, experts anticipate that about 70% of the population would need to be vaccinated against the novel coronavirus for us to achieve herd immunity. Next slide, please. Now, traditionally, vaccine development is kind of a long process. It typically takes an average of about 10 years or more from the preclinical development, which might include things like the research, the isolation of viruses or proteins in a lab, and even animal testing, to the introduction to market and market authorization of a vaccine so that it's ready for use in humans in the community. In fact, compared to what we see is in the news now, phase 3 trials, which are the largest and longest trials in human subjects, actually take several years so that they can even study long-term effects. Now, obviously, because we're in a pandemic, there's a huge rush to get a vaccination, because if you can imagine, naturally through infection processes, we won't see a rate of 70% of the population go through the coronavirus infection. So we'll need to attempt to achieve herd immunity through a vaccination program. So what we suspect is that there's going to be significant early regulatory approval of a coronavirus vaccine that may come after months instead of years of phase 3 trials. So there's a lot of different media organizations and government organizations that are tracking the coronavirus vaccine candidates right now. And what we see is there's probably about 160 or so vaccines that are in a race essentially to come to market for widespread use in the communities. And what we'll probably see is that we'll need multiple of these vaccines available in the market to achieve vaccination throughout the communities throughout the world. Right now, most interestingly, there have been 2 vaccines that have been approved for either early or limited use, while the other ones are still working feverishly to gain that approval through the standard trial process, testing for safety and for efficacy of the vaccination. So the first vaccine that was approved was a Chinese vaccine that, in fact, it's been approved for limited use. So not everybody in China is eligible to receive this vaccination, but it's been approved for use in the military for the next year. Now, there are many different types of vaccines that are possible, and the type of vaccine that's been approved in China is called a viral vector vaccine. And what they do is they take some of the genetic programming or the protein of the coronavirus, and they inject it into another virus that can infect humans. In this case, they use an adenovirus, which can cause common cold in human beings. Now, the adenovirus vector that's being used to transmit the genetic information of the coronavirus vaccine into the human host is not an infectious virus. It's been deemed inert in a way that it won't infect and cause a common cold, but it will at least be a vehicle to allow the genetic information and the protein of the coronavirus to be recognized by the human host's immune system. Now, interestingly, Russia has approved for early approval the first vaccine that isn't for limited use, according to reports. But one thing that's noted is that it has been approved before the large-scale long-term phase 3 trials have begun, and those are beginning as we speak. This is also a viral vector vaccine, and they are also using adenovirus as the vector for the coronavirus material used to stimulate the host immune system. So what's happening in Canada? Well, we heard that many countries were signing agreements with companies that were developing vaccines to basically reserve doses once available and approved. And just recently, we heard news that Canada had signed a deal with 2 companies, Pfizer and Moderna, for their experimental coronavirus vaccines. Now, some of the information that wasn't available was how many doses of the vaccines they had reserved. And the response was that we know there's going to be millions of doses, but the Canadian government is also in talks with other vaccine producers to reserve other vaccine doses. And until they see what happens with the trials that are going on with these vaccines, they haven't solidified the number of doses, according to reports. So let's take a closer look at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, because these are the ones that we'll be exposed to potentially here in Canada. Now, interestingly, both Moderna and Pfizer, their leading candidates for vaccine are of the subtype called mRNA vaccines. If you look at the name Moderna, you'll see that within Moderna, there's actually the letters mRNA. And that's interesting because Moderna's approach to all of their vaccines is through the mRNA process, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. Now, Pfizer has been working on multiple potential coronavirus vaccines, but their leading candidate for a vaccine to be successful and bring to market is an mRNA vaccine right now. So what is an mRNA vaccine? An mRNA vaccine is a vaccine that uses mRNA, so genetic coding, that codes for a specific protein of the virus. And what they do is they inject this genetic coding in such a way that it will get into human host cells to replicate, and then for the human host immune system to recognize the protein. If we look at the next slide, we can explain in a little bit more detail. So if you are able to inject genetic coding or mRNA into a human host, it needs a vehicle to carry it. And what happened is that they found in the early days of mRNA vaccines, the mRNA material, that genetic coding, was very unstable when they tried to inject it into human hosts. So it would either break down and be ineffective, or it would cause certain side effects potentially. But what the companies have done now is that they're enhancing the vehicle, in this case, most often a lipid nanoparticle, that can get that genetic material into the human host cells, where the genetic material is used by the human host mechanisms to turn it into a protein. In these cases, it's usually related to that famous spike protein of the coronavirus. And then antigen presenting cells will present the spike protein once it's made to the human host's immune system to build an immune response. Some of the advantages of mRNA vaccines are that we understand that in addition to stimulating the immune system to respond with neutralizing antibodies, it also initiates a T cell response. And if you have heard about the scientific aspects of what it will take to build immunity against coronavirus, it is thought that for coronavirus specifically, you'll need neutralizing antibodies and a T cell response to properly immunize against an infection. The nice thing about the mRNA vaccine is you're not injecting coronavirus into a human host. So there's no risk that it will multiply out of control and cause a coronavirus infection. Instead, you're just taking genetic coding for some of the virus's protein to present to the human host's immune system to build an immune response. The other thing is it's much faster than trying to isolate a virus, make it safe enough to inject in a human host, and then have the human host build a safe and efficient immune response. So Pfizer is starting a large-scale phase 3 trial with 30,000 patients with a vaccine that codes for part of that spike protein. Now, interestingly enough, they chose one of their two mRNA vaccines because in earlier, smaller scale studies, it showed that the B2 vaccine, as they're calling it, had fewer side effects than the B1. So that's already encouraging, is that they're choosing to move forward with their most efficient vaccine that has the least potential side effects. Now, the CEO of Pfizer recently suggested that they'll have a status update ready from their phase 3 trial in October 2020, so just a few months after starting. And it's noted that the US already has an agreement with Pfizer for 100 million doses, with the option to obtain 500 million more doses if needed at a later point in time. Now, when it comes to Moderna, They are also starting a large-scale phase 3 trial. I believe it was right at the end of July that they announced this, with also 30,000 patients. Their mRNA vaccine codes material for the entire spike protein of the coronavirus, and they're looking to produce about 500 million doses per year of their vaccine, if successful. So when is this all going to come out? The question is on everybody's mind. When? Well, the race is on, and we're very lucky because, as you can see, there's at least 160 companies, 160 vaccines being worked on by different companies to try and get a safe and efficient vaccine out. But what we realize is this will not be an instantaneous process, because what happens is once the vaccine becomes available, then we need to institute a program where we can actually obtain widespread vaccination within our communities. So who's first in line for the vaccine? And I think what happens is, especially when you have limited dosing to start with, first, we often tend to immunize healthcare workers. One, because they're most commonly exposed to the viruses, and two, because they're needed to actually help fight the infection in people who acquire the infection. Secondly, we have to decide on what the subtype of risk groups are for high-risk individuals. So depending on the different types of viruses that we're looking at, there may be different high-risk individuals. Now, we've heard a lot about, people over the age of 65, people with certain medical conditions, people with different medications that they're taking with suppressed immune systems might be the most high risk. But then we also wonder about, will children be high-risk individuals? And what will the safety and efficacy of a vaccine against coronavirus mean for pregnant women who are also considered high risk in many situations? So how will you actually obtain the vaccine? Well, it will be disseminated through doctors' offices, and we know that many vaccines are being authorized, including flu vaccines, at the pharmacy these days. But I can imagine with the race to vaccinate the population once vaccines are introduced to the market, we are going to see various public health programs with both education and information about vaccines that come to market, as well as opportunities for easy access for different populations to obtain the vaccine. I could imagine there being kiosks in the community, for example, at a mall or at a grocery store, where public health will set up programs where people can easily obtain the vaccination if they're wishing to get it. So what are some possible concerns or issues that arise with the introduction of a vaccine into the population? So the first one is efficacy. The second is, what's the long-term safety? Let's go ahead to efficacy. We know that vaccines are not 100% effective. So a vaccine is unlikely to be the panacea that the media is portraying. You can imagine that we're lucky if a vaccine can be 70 to 80% effective. And really the truth is the more people that get vaccinated to attempt to obtain immunity, the less effective it is necessary for that vaccine to be. So if everybody is altruistic and does their part to join the vaccination program, then we don't need a 100% effective vaccine necessarily. Other questions that we'll have is, how long is it effective for? How long will people remain immune to the coronavirus with the vaccines that are introduced to market? And then the other question is, will individuals require follow-up or booster vaccinations? So for example, we know with the flu, we need a new vaccine every year because the flu virus is always mutating. Will that be the case with the coronavirus and the coronavirus vaccine in 2021, 2022, and beyond? That is still to be told. There will be concerns about safety. You see, the rapid pace of development, we talked about the expedited nature of testing and approval of coronavirus vaccines, means that we will only learn about certain safety issues, potentially the long-term safety issues, sometime after the vaccine is introduced to market. Now, to be fair, we do continue to study the effects of vaccines or medications, regardless of how long it takes to bring them to market once they've been introduced into the community. And post-marketing surveillance is always a part of any vaccine or medication that's brought to market. In fact, we've seen vaccines or medications that have been shut down before due to post-marketing data that has shown an issue with safety. However, the concern is this could create a backlash on which the anti-vaccination movement could capitalize on to try and convince people not to join the vaccination program. So what about supply? Will there be enough to go around in Canada? Will we be late to the party to obtain the vaccines once they come to market, behind other countries like the US or Russia or China? And there might be controversies regarding who gets it first. Will everybody understand when we talk about high-risk individuals who are first in line to obtain the vaccine? Lastly, there may be concerns for employers, how they integrate a vaccine strategy for their employers. Firstly, it's difficult to mandate vaccination for employees. It's even difficult within a government to mandate for the population vaccination. So are employers going to require vaccination for their employees, or are they going to strongly encourage? Can a company stipulate that you can't show up to your workplace and you'll have to continue to work from home unless you've taken a vaccine? One thing that we find is that it may be important for employers to seek counsel from their legal experts to shape the direction of their integration of a vaccination program amongst their employee population. So what does this mean for a post-vaccine world? Does everything return to normal as it was in 2019? Well, as we talked about earlier, we expect herd immunity will likely require approximately 70% of the population to become immune. And we'll only really be able to achieve that through a strong vaccination program. So unfortunately, it does mean that we will have to continue in some way or another social distancing, hand hygiene, and masks within the community, despite the rollout of a vaccine for quite some time. Even Dr. Theresa Tam had mentioned on August 4th that we should be forewarned that a vaccine will not be a silver bullet in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. And she mentioned that the government's planning for pandemic management for a longer term of 2 to 3 years as we roll out a vaccine, learn more about it, and eventually hopefully achieve herd immunity within our community. So do people have questions on today's presentation?
That was, Dr. Abrams, thanks very much. That was great. There are questions, and we'll just start rolling through them as people ask them as well. So, okay, the first question, I'm not sure we know the answer to this, but I have had some reactions to vaccine medical devices in the past. What is the exact syringe or needle used for this vaccine? So do we know that? Do we know what sort of syringe is going to be used?
Yeah, so we don't have that information yet. The only reports that are coming out so far, for example, are that companies are testing whether people will need one dose or a second dose a few weeks after the first one for the initial vaccine strategy. But the details of what quantity of the solution or whether it's an intramuscular or subcutaneous injection, I think all of that is still being studied. And there's no confirmation yet.
Gotcha. So TBD.
TBD.
Okay. So just to run this by, so the math. So if the vaccine is 70% effective, let's say, like a good range would be 70% effective, and if we need 70% of the population to take the vaccine to achieve herd immunity, does that mean essentially that everybody needs to take the vaccine to achieve herd immunity if the only way that we're achieving herd immunity is through the vaccine? Do you understand that question?
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is that the more people that vaccinate, the more likely we'll see this suppressed within our community. If everybody relies on others around them to help in the fight against the pandemic by vaccinating, we might see that the virus will continue to flare up within our community over time because not enough people will be immune to it. I definitely don't recommend a strategy that many have tried in different parts of the world, which is I will just get the virus and then I will become immune and I'll get over it. Because one is we never know who will suffer serious consequences from getting the virus. And two, we don't know enough about the virus and the immune response that we build from an infection itself in terms of how long we become immune for reinfection. In fact, the first case reports came out that they confirmed in Hong Kong somebody who was infected in March, who was only in his 30s, actually was confirmed by viral testing to have a second infection of the coronavirus. And although that might be rare, that's a pretty short amount of time for him to be immune from his first infection before getting a second infection. Now, the other point that I want to make is that the vaccine companies are trying to initiate an immune response that is much more significant than what we would see with an infection to try and achieve longer lasting immunity, better protection against viral infection than one might see even from getting the virus itself.
So that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, the Hong Kong reinfection report. So that dates from yesterday. There was this big news that everybody was talking about on social media that a young man had been infected and then 4.5 months later was reinfected. So does that change anything, or does that have any implications as it pertains to vaccine and vaccine development?
I think really the vaccine will target a longer lasting immune response, and the companies that are working on the vaccines can look at, neutralizing antibody response. They can look at T cell response. These are things that we don't really test in individuals. We test antibody presence potentially, but we don't test, to the nitty gritty specifics that the vaccine companies would be testing the response to their products, because it's actually very labor intensive, time intensive to do those. And we can't do those on a widespread scale necessarily in the community. But the vaccine companies are targeting those to understand the nature of immunity that is elicited from the vaccines that they are introducing. And that will help the government shape authorization and also direction on, do we need revaccination at some point in the future?
Yeah, should someone who has already been infected with the virus, do they need to be vaccinated as well?
I think that's a question that is still yet to be answered. I think there's the potential that somebody who's been infected with coronavirus and recovered from the coronavirus infection may still be a candidate for future coronavirus vaccination. And we see examples of this in the past. I mean, the shingles vaccination, for example. Somebody can have had an episode of shingles and they will be eligible for shingles vaccination to try and suppress a future recurrence of shingles infection. So this might be the case with coronavirus vaccination in the context of people who've already been infected, particularly if researchers find that immunity wanes over time after you've been infected with coronavirus.
Okay, so this is a question, how important is longer term testing of the vaccine? In your opinion, how much risk are we taking by not having that for COVID vaccine?
Well, I think that long-term studies are very important. There are some things that you can't necessarily understand about the effects of a treatment or a preventive measure initially when it's first rolled out to market. However, we have to weigh the risks and benefits of vaccinating versus not vaccinating, because we have to weigh the risks of the vaccine versus the risks of acquiring the infection. As much as we don't know about the vaccine, we still don't know enough about the virus itself in terms of who is going to end up needing ventilation in an ICU, who is going to end up passing away from the virus. And as a result of that, I think that as a medical community as a whole, we are going to understand that there are some limitations to what we know about the vaccines, but a significant proportion of the medical community will still encourage vaccination once it has gone through enough rigorous testing to show at least the short-term efficacy and the short-term safety profile of the vaccine, even if we can't comment on it. If we waited 5 or 10 years for the vaccine to be studied for long-term effects, we might have missed the boat in terms of protecting our community against the coronavirus infection.
Well, that's interesting. So somebody did submit a question. When, essentially, when will you suggest that your family gets it, in terms of the, like, are you going to be one of the first people in line? Are you going to wait a little bit? Like, what is your own personal strategy? I mean, I guess this is probably crossing a personal line maybe, but what is your strategy in terms of getting the vaccine for you and your loved one?
Well, I mean, I look at it for myself. I'm a healthcare worker and I'm exposed to patients, and I'm also exposed to my personal loved ones and acquaintances and colleagues. And I know through my work that there are many people who wish that they could be vaccinated against certain things, and they are not able to, either because of the medical conditions that they suffer from or the treatments that they're taking for certain medical conditions. And as a result, I always put myself, and I'm proud to say that I would consider myself a pro-vaxxer, because I put myself in line for vaccination first. So I can protect myself, but more importantly, I can protect my family and I can protect my patients. I would feel terrible if I ended up with a virus that I infected a patient with, who the patient wasn't able to receive the vaccine against if it was their choice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There is one last question, which I think this will be the last question we take. How important is it to have antibody testing? I'm not sure how, I'm not sure how that pertains particularly to the vaccine itself. And that may be outside of the scope of this webinar, and particularly since the next webinar that we're doing September 8th is going to be specifically on testing overall.
Yeah, I mean, but I've been working with Medcan on introducing the antibody test to our clients, and so and the community. So I'm happy to answer this. I think there is a specific niche for the antibody testing, which is there's a lot of people who weren't eligible for swab testing at a time that they were sick early on in the pandemic. And many people are interested to know, did I have coronavirus at that time? Was it a flu? Was it a cold? Was it COVID? And many people are interested to know. The truth is that we are very clear with our clientele that the coronavirus antibody test that has been introduced to the market is not telling us any specific information about your immunity against future coronavirus infection or reinfection. But the only thing it will tell you is it will resolve for you, have I been exposed to the coronavirus infection before? Now, I think in the future, as we study antibodies and neutralizing antibodies and T-cell responses, we'll probably be able to get more precision information from antibody testing, including potentially what people's responses are to vaccination against coronavirus. But the current antibody testing is really for people who are interested, was I exposed to coronavirus in the past? But I want to make clear, it doesn't tell us, were you immune? Or can I do something different than public health recommendations right now when I'm going about my daily life? For example, hand washing, social distancing, and masking.
That's fantastic. So we're a bit over time. So we'll wrap up. Other resources from Medcan. So we just posted this week, latest episode of the Eat, Move, Think podcast, episode 28, the best ever protein explainer with Professor Stuart Phillips. That's C's Globe and Mail nutrition columnist and Medcan's food and nutrition director, Leslie Beck, interviewing the world authority on the interaction of aging, protein, and muscle development, Stuart Phillips. That podcast has been doing very well. Lots of people downloading it, and it's an interesting explainer about how much protein you should eat and whether you should eat more as you fight aging. And then we've already talked about COVID-19 testing tools explained. That's September 8th. That's our next webinar. In September, we move to an every 2-week cadence. We talk about bi-monthly. I never know what bi-monthly is, but essentially it's every 2 weeks. So that'll be Mike Saliga and Dr. Peter Nord, our Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Jason Abrams, thanks so much for today. Any final or closing words?
No, well, I really appreciate everybody who attended today. I hope that I've been able to provide some insight into what's coming in the pipeline. The truth is there's still a lot of information to be determined. We're hopeful that sometime, in the first quarter or second quarter of 2021, some vaccines will be brought to market. It's everybody's choice whether they want to get vaccinated or not, but there are compelling reasons to do it for ourselves, our loved ones, and our community at large. So if there's any further developments, we'll obviously reassess, but exciting times ahead as we fight this pandemic.
Thanks so much, and let's hope that the vaccine comes. What you said spring, you're hoping for spring 2021. Let's hope it comes then. Let's hope it comes sooner. And have a great week, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thank you so much.